So we're going to talk a little bit about something that a lot of students tend to struggle with, mostly because they overthink it. Because some of the terminology that I generally use when we're talking about how to use your arm and how to pivot from the various joints that make up your arm, it tends to be a little strict, I guess would be the word. But really, I don't want you to waste so much time focusing too much on how you're using your arm. There are specific things that I want you to strive to follow, and there are reasons that I'll explain, but ultimately don't overthink it. Give it your best shot to use the specific pivots that I recommend, and that generally most artists will recommend, but don't fuss over it too much, because eventually, even if you're doing it somewhat incorrectly now, you will get better at it, you'll get more comfortable with it, and you will improve. Don't let it stop you from moving forward. So let's talk about the pivots of the arm. Here we have, let's use a different pen. We've got the wrist, the elbow, and the shoulder. When I say pivots of the arm, I mean these are the points from which you can kind of pin down and move your hand. So I can do it from my wrist, I can do it from my elbow, and I'll show you in a little bit what it looks like when I do it from my shoulder. When you pivot from the wrist, as shown here with the red line, your actual arc of motion is pretty limited because the radius from your wrist to where you hold your pen, so from here to about here, or really to the tip of your pen is what matters, is pretty small. So if you try and make a straight line, you're going to end up with a situation where you either arc immediately, or you're going to end up with a situation where you try and maintain that straight line by pivoting from your wrist, but then also pushing it along with your fingers. And this is a problem because when you're mixing two separate pivots in such a clear way, they're going to be fighting against each other for who's really driving the motion of the pen. There are ways that we inherently mix the pivots a little bit, but they're not in an equal manner where each pivot is kind of fighting for dominance. There's a clear dominant one and a subordinate one, and when you're mixing them in this fashion, both are trying to be dominant. The fingers are trying to push the pen, and the wrist is trying to orchestrate the whole thing, and it's a bit of a wobbly mess. So that's a mistake that you'll frequently see from beginners, that's how they will draw because they're used to using pens and pencils from their wrist because that's how you write. When we draw, or rather when we start out, we're familiar with that interaction, and we do it from our wrist, we write from our wrists for a very good reason. It gives us a lot of very fine control. This is control that you wouldn't get as easily from your elbow or your shoulder. And so there is definitely value there. And at no point in this am I saying you should never draw from your wrist, or you should never draw from your elbow, or you should never draw from your shoulder. I'm trying to introduce you to the idea that there are different pivots and there are different kinds of lines that you'll want to draw, and each pivot is going to be better for some and worse for others. So here you can find that this line is going to have a lot of very fine control, as I mentioned. Most of the lines that you want to draw through lesson 1, most of lesson 2, not including the texture stuff, and then through most of the construction that we do through the rest of the lessons 3 to 7, they all require a lot of smooth flowing lines. No wobbling from like pushing between two different pivots. No slowing down and trying to drive the line with your brain. You want to use your muscle memory for that, and you want to pivot from a point that has a greater radius. So when you go from your elbow, you're given a lot more room to work before you start getting a noticeable arc. As you can see here, it's much shallower than your wrist is. Even more so, your shoulder will give you an even greater radius. Now, The hardest one to work with is your shoulder, and the reason for that is because it's not something that we use in our everyday life. Usually, in most beginners, the muscles that you need to use for employing your shoulder while drawing, they're not going to be as developed. And so doing so is going to frequently leave you feeling more tired more quickly. It'll be a little bit sore because you'll be pushing yourself with new muscles, basically. And so those are things to keep in mind. And this makes it the hardest pivot to work with, and especially the hardest pivot to learn to work with, because you haven't already done that work in other fields while writing, while just manipulating things in your everyday life. We use our elbow and our wrists constantly, but we don't really use our shoulders in this fashion. And for that reason, I want you to work with your shoulder as much as possible. Any lines that require a smooth, confident stroke need to be drawn from your shoulder. And it's not because they are always best drawn from your shoulder in terms of the execution and the line that you get. Your elbow is often pretty good for a lot of these lines. I could probably manage that length. I did that mostly for my elbow. So it's not about which joint is best for the task. It's about the fact that we are training ourselves to learn to use our arms so we are in a position to decide which pivot is going to be best for a given line. Now, if you've only worked with your elbow and your wrist and you're faced with a very long, smooth line that you need to produce, you are less likely to choose to do it from the shoulder because you're going to be inclined to take the path of least resistance, meaning the path that is easiest for you, or at least the least difficult one. The shoulder, if you haven't practiced with it, is going to be so difficult for you to use when you really need to that you're not even going to consider it, and therefore you're immediately going to step down to a lesser option. And that's not an approach that you should be using when drawing. If something is difficult, that's not a good enough reason not to do it. It's all about what you're trying to achieve and what would be the best tool, the best technique to achieve the goal that you want. And so that's something that plays a big role here, and it will play a big role throughout, because the Drawabox lessons demand a lot of patience, a lot of focus, and a lot of time from students, but they also tend to have very good results over time. So I will demonstrate what it's like to, or what it looks like to draw from each pivot. I'll get rid of this page. So you'll notice that I have this shaky board here. I'm using an angled drawing surface that I threw together with a cheap drawing board. It has this clip down here that kind of keeps the pad that I'm drawing on from sliding down, although this has a tendency to slide down on me a little bit. And it's just propped up on a very large box. So this is my cheap drawing table for now. I actually do have a real drawing table, but because I'm a tiny man, it is too high for me to work on. So I'm using this instead, and it's worth showing you guys how you can put together a drawing surface that'll work decently without having to throw a bunch of money away at a brand new desk. Most people aren't really in a position to do that, but there should be a way that you can stick this down a little bit better. Maybe I don't know, have some sort of a support up here, but for now I'm just going to leave it as it is. Maybe I'll reduce the angle a little bit so it slides less. That's better. All right, so first let's talk about drawing from the wrist. If I'm trying to draw a straight line from the wrist, it's generally going to look, I've already shown you several times, but it's going to look something like that. And so you do have wobbles. You can get okay at it, but it's still really not the best. It's a matter of trying to synchronize your fingertips and your wrist, and it's really not a great use of your time. Next, you've got the elbow, where I will adjust this camera a little bit so you can see that better. Focus more on the movement of my arm rather than the pen that you can't really see. And so if I'm pinning this down, the elbow is going to draw a line, draw kind of like that, where my wrist My wrist does not pivot at all. It is locked in place and it is firmly locked because this does not need to move at all. I'm holding my pen in a tripod grip. There's a few variations of this. It really doesn't matter how you hold your pen. It's just make sure that the tip here, I don't know if that's going to focus there. Oh, almost got it. Doesn't want to focus. Okay, well, the tip has a little bit of felt there where the ink comes out, and if you can alter how much pressure you apply, that's the main way that the thickness of your stroke is going to change. If you've got a pencil, you might hold it like this or like this to be able to use the side of the pencil and the tip as you need. But with pens, you really just need to be able to control how hard you press. So as long as your grip is comfortable and allows you to do that, that's fine. Don't hold your pencil too tightly. I'm using a pretty relaxed grip here, and that's really all you need. And don't press down too hard, because that is going to cause you to damage your pen tips. You only really need to make contact, maybe press a little bit harder to get some extra weight out of it, but you don't want to be pressing really hard all the time and digging into the page. When you damage your pen tips, the ink flow kind of gets clogged, and this often leads people to believe that their pens are dying, but they're not actually. It's just that they're not using them correctly. Anyway, so as I was saying, you pivot from your elbow, wrist is locked, and you're just opening up that elbow. So that's a valid approach, but it's one that I don't want you to use through these lessons, because if you use that, you're just going to end up training that, and you're going to leave your shoulder untrained, really, and those muscles undeveloped, so that when you actually do need to use your shoulder, you're not going to be in a position to do so. So, actually drawing from the shoulder, I'll try and get a full view of my shoulder at least. So, when I use my shoulder, I'm still opening my elbow somewhat, but it's not very much, and the motion is completely driven from the shoulder, from the muscles that control the shoulder. The elbow is opening up to kind of compensate for the fact that I'm trying to move my arm in a certain way while maintaining contact with the page. It is very much subordinate. So it's not the same as when I was trying to draw with my wrist and then also pushing on the pen. Those were two kind of equal movements that were competing with each other, whereas this is the elbow compensating. And you can actually move your whole body if you really want to, but this is really the easiest way of engaging your shoulder, letting your elbow open slightly, but not having this drive the motion. And so as you can see here, these lines that I've been drawing from my shoulder are all quite smooth, and they are fairly straight. And so just to show you that again, shoulder drives the motion, and your elbow compensates slightly. And working on this angled surface that I'm doing here helps to reduce how much your elbow actually needs to compensate. You can certainly do this on a flat surface. It's not as easy. It's not that much harder. Flat surface is how I learned, because I didn't bother with angled surfaces when I was taking classes. But, angled is better. Flat surface is perfectly okay. What was the other thing that I wanted to mention? So on that note, one thing that some people sometimes ask me is whether it's okay to rest your hand or your elbow on the table. And there's a simple answer for this: yes and no. Resting your hand on the surface, on the page or on the table or whatever, is okay. It's not the best, but it's also still better usually than trying to let your hand hover like this. Reason being, if you're hovering, you have no real anchors that are keeping your hand pinned to the surface that you're drawing on. So you're not going to have extra drag that causes you to screw up how you're using your hand. But not having that stability can be quite challenging for people, and especially at different angles. Resting your hand gently on the page is not going to anchor you so much that it causes such a significant problem. It's a trade-off where you do have that risk and you should be aware of it, but it's something that you should always be aware of. Just because your hand is hovering doesn't mean that you're not using your elbow too much and not using your shoulder, or that you are using your shoulder correctly. You need to always be aware of that, and just having your hand resting on the surface is not going to cause you so much trouble. However, resting your elbow like this provides such a heavy anchor that you are almost guaranteed to start drawing more with or completely with your elbow without engaging your shoulder at all. So that is something that I would definitely avoid. Another point that I wanted to raise is when I talk about the ghosting method, I specifically mentioned in one of the steps that you should be rotating your page. That's important. A lot of students come and will focus instead on trying to get a mastery of drawing lines in every angle. And that's not, I mean, it's valuable, but only so much. Your time is far better spent developing all the other skills, the many other skills that you need to use to draw. And if you're spending all your time focusing on just getting these lines to all work, to all come out smooth and straight from every different angle, it's just not the best use of your time. Other people who are following along with rotating the page and then moving forward are going to have much better results much faster than those who are dead set on learning to, command their arm to draw in every angle perfectly. And frankly, there are some angles that your body is just not really meant to draw in. So for example, the most natural angle is usually from, if you're right-handed, from your left upwards to your right. And so the opposite of that would be fairly awkward. And then there are other angles that are they're just awkward angles. And so if you stress so much about these little things that are as easily solved by rotating your page so that every mark is in a confident direction, it's just a waste of your time. On top of that, your range of angles at which you draw will expand naturally. Because when I'm sitting here and I'm not really thinking about it, which obviously we're all lazy, eventually we're going to end up being that way. If this is my most comfortable angle and this is getting kind of cluttered. I'll remove this. If this is my most comfortable angle and I'm being asked to draw a line that is more like this, it's not so much that I'm going to necessarily subconsciously remind myself to rotate the page, especially since I've had so much practice with rotating the page, with executing that one line really well. My chances of nailing this one are fairly high. And so my subconscious isn't even going to bother me about that. I'll move on to just, make the line, move on, whatever. By doing that, I'm getting that extra practice in, but I'm not really stressing about it. It's not something I'm actively doing. So gradually, your range will increase. Will it increase to the full 360 degrees? No. And if you really want to do that, do it later. Do it when you actually have the time to stress about that kind of thing. It's not important now. And so the last thing I want to talk about are just the pens that I'm using, which are the ones that I recommend for, or the type of pen rather, because I don't care about which brand you're using. But I recommend using fine liners, which are also referred to as felt tip pens or technical pens. It really depends on where you live. Sometimes the names are interchangeable, sometimes they're not. They're what I recommend for lessons 1 to 5. And then 6 and 7, I have a little bit more leeway, but generally make sure you pick these up, because the main thing is that when you make a mark, it's always a rich, dark mark. You're not really in a point where you get faded marks that you can really sketch with. So it forces you to face your mistakes. It forces you to think about every mark you put down and then deal with the consequences of that. And so I'm not sure if the camera's going to focus now. Let's just see if I can, how do I do this? There we go. So you can see there that the tip has this little felt nib at the end. That's generally what you're looking for. And I believe the ones that I recommend are the 0.5 size. The numbering is not always consistent. I know with Staedtler, I believe 0.5 corresponds to a 0.5 millimeter. Other brands like Faber-Castell also has some nice ones, which are sized F for fine. Is this thing gonna... There we go. F for fine. Also, I mean, if you don't have much to spend, Sharpie ultrafine markers are just fine. I mean, they work pretty well. It's not the big thick ones. It's the ones with the little nib here. The size is a little bit different than than the other pens that I'm recommending, but you know, they're still pretty good. I would not recommend working with 0.3s and 0.1s, and in general, try and stick to a single pen size when you're doing a drawing. Some people will try and do their detail in a smaller line weight. Don't. The reason that I want you to stick to one pen is that it forces you to learn to make different kinds of different line weights with pressure instead of switching up your pens. So I can make a line that is fairly thin or fairly thick. There's a good range of these. So thick, thin. My pen is actually pretty old. I haven't bought new ones in a while. So there's the Faber-Castell, the Staedtler pigment liners, Sharpie ultrafines, and also Sharpie has these Sharpie pens, which they're decent. Some of my students really do like them, especially because they're cheap. But I do find that the tips are a little bit plasticky, but they're all right. They're also a little bit on the thinner side, so keep that in mind. I usually err towards the thicker ones. 0.5, even 0.7 is okay. So try and keep that in mind. Pencil, obviously, I don't want you to work with that because it's you can sketch so lightly before really committing, and that's not the sort of thing I want you to do. I want you to think about the marks you put down before committing your lines. So, pencils are just too... It's not about the fact that you can erase them. That has nothing to do with it. It's the fact that when you put the mark down, you can be really timid about it and get away with that. That doesn't teach you a whole lot about being confident with your line work. So I think that's all I wanted to say on the matter of pens and using your arm and line work and all that. So I hope that helps. There is a page in the lesson dedicated to the matters of the pivots of your arm and whatever. So be sure to check that out, because when you read through it, especially after having watched the video, it can make more sense. It can click more for things that you didn't understand. If you still have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Thanks for watching.